Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about labor POs, the different functions of labor POs, how to create labor POs, and we'll also go into a little bit of how you can modify the settings of labor POs. So before we start getting into the creation of labor POs, I just want to talk about what the purpose of a labor PO is in the Flex system. I break it down typically to two main purposes. Number one, to request labor. You might be requesting that from a labor provider, whether that be something like a Rhino or a local union or something like that. And the other reason would be to keep track of your labor expenses. So you could, as people send in their bills to you for the labor they performed for you, then you can create records of that through a labor PO. You can also push those labor POs out to QuickBooks, and we'll look at that a little bit near the end of the webinar. There are also two different ways that you can create a labor PO in the system. Number one, you can create one just as a standalone labor PO, and that would be on your New menu up in the right-hand corner, and then just click New Labor PO. But you also have the option to create a labor PO as a child to another element. So in this example, we have a quote that we could go down to the Add Child Elements section and click Add Labor PO. And that'll create the same type of labor PO document as if you were creating one as a standalone. It's just going to create it as a child to the parent. You could also do this for an event folder. So say you have an event folder that has 5, 6, 7 different quotes, but you want to keep track of all of the labor costs just in one document, then from the event folder you could create a labor PO as well. So the first example that I want to share in keeping track of your labor expenses actually doesn't even involve a labor PO at all. And the only reason that I want to share this is to show you that within Flex, you could make it as basic or as complex as you want in terms of how you're keeping track of your different costs and expenses. So in this example, let's say that we haven't added a labor PO to this quote, and we really only have a couple of labor roles on this quote, and maybe just as a practice in your company, you don't necessarily push out labor POs to your QuickBooks, and you don't necessarily need to keep track of those expenses with its own element. What you can do is use the cost field for this line item on a quote. Now, of course, the cost field isn't visible here on the main working view of the quote, but if you go to the profit markup view, you do have this cost field where you can enter what the actual cost is for that labor role. And so there might be a few different scenarios here. In this example, I have 4 stagehands working on this job, and I'm saying that each one cost me $225 for a day rate, and I'm charging my customer $250. So marked up a little bit, and I'm making a 10% profit on that. And so this is the most basic form of how you can keep track of labor costs, is just by using that cost field, and you can hand type anything into this field. Now, if I had a specific labor role, so for example, let's say that this job had a lighting programmer, I could put that onto the quote. I charge the customer $500. But let's say that the lighting programmer that I use for this job charges me $450. So in this case, it's more of a specific, after I get the bill from that specific lighting programmer, I could type in exactly what they're charging me. And of course, I could always come back and type in actual charges. This might just be an estimate. I know that they typically charge $450, but maybe there was some overtime. So maybe it was closer to $500. At this point, I would be making a 0% profit on that. So that is the most basic way that you can keep track of your labor expenses. But of course, this webinar is about labor POs, so let's look at how we can keep track of labor expenses using a labor PO. So I'm going to delete the labor from this quote just for now. And in fact, for our first example, let's look at how we would create a labor PO to request labor. So again, you could do this one of two ways: create it as a standalone, or you could be in a job and click Add Labor PO so that you could add it as a child to the job. So let's say that I want it to be associated directly with this job. So I'm going to add Labor PO from this quote. It's going to inherit most of the information from the quote, including the venue. This particular one was just a will call quote, so it's just saying will call, but we can just imagine that this is at an actual venue. In fact, we could probably go, let's open another quote in this system that will have that information. So this one is at an actual venue. Let's add the labor PO to this one. Oops, I accidentally clicked expense sheet. And so we could basically keep all of this information as is. The only difference is we're going to be entering a vendor. And in this case, we're probably going to choose somebody from our labor providers. And this is going to be things like your local union, or if you have like a Rhino or another similar labor provider in your area, this might be who you're going to be using as the vendor, because we're going to be requesting specific labor roles from whoever that vendor is. In this case, let's use Rhino, and then we'll just click Accept to create that PO. Your labor PO is much like all of your other financial documents. The layout is very similar. The build process is just the same, where you drag and drop things onto the labor PO. And so in this case, let's say that I'm requesting from Rhino 6 stagehands and maybe a couple graphics operators. And at this point, you can make a couple of choices. You can either say most of these labor providers have some sort of cost sheet that shows how much it will cost to get that labor role. Sometimes if you're requesting a specific person, that might be a different cost. So at this point, you could either say enter those costs in that you expect them to be, or just leave it blank, because at this point, we're really just requesting the labor from the labor provider. One thing that's not necessarily set up by default in a new Flex system is the ability to send a labor PO to a vendor. Of course, you could always just generate the PDF, get your own PDF, and then use your own email program to send it out. But if you want the ability to actually send it out to the vendor as well, there's a couple things you would have to do. On the Projects menu, we're going to go to Project Elements and look at the settings for our labor PO. So we'll double-click Labor PO. And the way that you can get that send to vendor option is by going to your contact associations. And in the vendor row that we have here, you just want to make sure that there is an email template chosen. A lot of your systems might just say none right now. And if it's set to none, then when you're on your labor PO, you're not going to see the send to vendor option. But if you choose one of the templates, and in this case we already have one by default that is an email PDF to vendor, we're just going to choose that, then click Update. And now your labor PO document, after refreshing it or reloading it, should have the send to vendor option. And of course, what that does is just put together a nice little email template, and it will have the labor PO PDF attached, and it will send to whatever email address you have on file for the vendor. In addition to the option to send it directly to the vendor, you also have your workflow options. And this is set up just like your other POs, where when it's initially created, you may need to submit it for approval. So we'll go through that process first. Then at this point, let's say that we've heard back from the vendor. They've given us the exact costs. I don't know exactly what they would charge, but let's just throw in some basic numbers for day rates. And just like on a quote, you could change the rate as well. Maybe you're only doing hourly rates, but in this example, let's stick with the day rate. At which point you can either reject or approve the PO, and then just go through the entire workflow process from there. If you integrate with QuickBooks, typically when Flex Support helps you set up that QuickBooks integration, they will go into the project element settings for your labor PO and also change the workflow, because we have a normal labor PO workflow and we have a labor PO workflow with QuickBooks. So if you are all set up for QuickBooks integration and you've already been using it, but you find that your labor POs aren't giving you the option to export to QuickBooks, then you'll know that you could just go, again, that was on the projects menu, project elements, and we're looking at the labor PO. On that very first tab of identity and exposure is where you would change which workflow you're using, and you would just change that to the labor PO workflow with QuickBooks. The only difference between the two is that once you get to the point where we are now and we finalize the PO, then that would give us, after that, that would give us the option to push this PO to QuickBooks. But since my system isn't set up for QuickBooks, I just have the normal labor PO workflow. And so that's scenario number one. Of course, on the job, I would still go back and add those labor roles because I still need to charge to the client. And so I believe it was 6 that I had requested on the PO. Yeah, that's right, 6 stagehands. And I would just charge either my normal amount or just pass the exact cost on. Just depends on how your company works. If you're trying to make a little bit of a profit on your labor, or if you're just passing the cost directly to your customer. And then we would add those 2 graphics operators as well. Give them a price. And I want to show you how this works in terms of using our new job costing tab. Remember in the previous example, we just went in and added the costs directly to the cost field of those lines. We're not going to do this in this example, because if we look at our job costing now, you'll see under the labor, we have both the planned revenue, which is all of the prices that we're charging to the client, but then we also have expenses. And this is what's coming from that labor PO. So since we created the labor PO as a child to this quote, it's being included in the job costing calculations here. So in this case, we can see that we are planning on charging this much for labor. This is how much that we are going to have to spend on it, and it will show us what our profit loss is on that. Same thing would work with an event folder. Like I mentioned earlier, if you add a labor PO to an event folder, you could go to the job costing tab of the event folder, and it would show that labor PO as an actual expense. And so that's the first scenario. Again, in this scenario, we were just requesting labor, but then of course this labor PO could also go on to be the document that we use as what we push to QuickBooks, or the record of how much we had to pay for that labor. Another scenario that you might use a labor PO for would be to have a document or a bill that is specific to one person that you might have hired. So instead of just putting general labor roles on a labor PO, we might put an actual contact, like somebody in our freelance labor or in our employees pool. There's a few steps that we have to take in order for that to work properly. So let's walk through that now. Let's close this PO that we made here. And let's open another one of our older jobs. And I believe I had some labor on this one already. Yes, and I do. So let's say that this job is already passed. This is what we charged for the video switcher for this job. And now we want a record of what we actually had to pay to the person who fulfilled that role. They sent us in a bill, we're making that payment, and we want a labor PO to reflect that we paid that much to that person. So in this case, let's again create a labor PO as a child to the quote. And the vendor in this case, we might say, is the actual person. So let's choose one of my freelance labor here. I'll choose Willie Brown. And then we have one of two options here. number one, we could just do the same thing that we did on the quote and put a video switcher on. And then maybe in the notes field, say this is Willie Brown. And the total bill was for $450. So again, if we go back to the original quote and look at our job costing tab, now we're going to see all of the labor that we had. And this is, I believe, charging for both the video switcher and I think we had something else. It might have been a stagehand on this job. And then you can see that $450 from the labor PO is also being calculated in our job costing tab. And then at this point, we could send this out to the vendor if we have to, but they may or may not need a record of us recording that payment. And then we can go through the workflow process, submit it for approval, and send it out to QuickBooks so that we have a record of having made that payment to this vendor. There is another option that you can use. Instead of just putting a labor role directly onto the PO, we can enable different resource types so that we can drag and drop the person themselves onto this labor PO. So let's delete the labor role that we put on there already. If we go up to our freelance labor and try to put Willie Brown on here, notice what happens. It's not letting me put anything on there. And there's a perfectly good reason for this. We need to go back to our project element settings for our labor PO. And we have to enable the resource types that we want to be able to drag and drop onto the labor PO. So in this case, freelance labor is the resource type that we're trying to put onto the PO. And you can see that that is currently not enabled. So I'm just going to click on that and say, yes, I do want that to be enabled. You might also do that for your labor provider, maybe even your employees as well. And then click Update. And so now when I go back to my labor PO, and I'll probably have to refresh it just so that those changes will take effect. And if I try to drag and drop Willie Brown on there, it does actually put him onto that labor PO. One thing that you'll notice is that the cost automatically filled in. And the way that you do that is you'll open the contact entry, and on the term/notes tab, you have these bill rates down here. And whatever is in the cost for this contact will be what defaults when you put them on a labor PO. So you might have a really good idea of what this person charges every time, and let's assume that a good amount of your jobs don't really run into overtime, and so whatever their day rate is, you can be 90% sure that that's what you're going to pay them. And so you would put that into the cost field here. So I know that Willie typically charges $500, so whenever I put him onto a labor PO, it defaults to $500. Of course, I can always click on that because in this industry, a lot of times things don't go quite as planned. There will be overtime, and so you might have to change that. But I just wanted to show you that you can put a default into the contact entries bill rates just so that always pops up. And again, we would go through the workflow process and we can export that out to QuickBooks. One last thing that we want to look at in terms of this example, if you do enable other resource types like your employees, freelance labor, or labor providers to be on these labor POs, you might want to go to your financial settings, so financials menu and then accounting integration, and look at how different resource types are pushing out to QuickBooks. A lot of these are set up by default, and most of you probably can get by with just the default. So for example, anything that's rental that gets pushed out will go into the rental income account. Anything that's retail into retail income, etc. Notice that freelance labor, labor providers, and employees don't have a default account. And so what's going to happen is that these would actually push to whatever the default sales account is. So if you push this labor PO out to QuickBooks, because I haven't enabled any default account for freelance labor, this amount is actually going to push into my whatever default sales account is, so my rental income. And I imagine you probably don't want that. So what you'll do is just find those resource types, and you're going to assign which sales account they're going into. Now, if you've done a GL account sync, you probably have a lot more accounts than I do in this test system. You might even have a specific account for freelance labor, but a lot of people might just say anything that's freelance is just going to go into my labor income. And so you might set those for each or any of the labor type resource types that you've enabled to go onto your labor POs. And if you use a purchase account, you might do the same thing here. So again, just remember, if you are going to enable freelance labor, employees, or any other contact resource type to be put on your labor POs, you just might want to go to your financials and accounting integration and make sure that those resource types are pushing to a sales account that makes sense. Last thing we want to look at, if we just go back to our projects menu, project elements, and the labor PO. If you're already familiar with the settings for your project elements, then you should be pretty comfortable with the labor PO settings, because this is just another financial document, just like your quote. And so a lot of the settings are, or at least a lot of the tabs that you have are similar. Of course, a lot of the settings might be a little bit different, because on your labor PO, you'll notice we don't have pretty much almost all of the fields are not enabled because you don't really need those. Your child elements might be fewer reports that you could actually print. But just like as you go in and modify your quote settings, it works a lot the same with your labor POs. If you're not really comfortable with these settings, we do have some good videos on our YouTube page and some sections in our user manual that explain these different tabs and what they do. So I would encourage that you look at some of those if you're interested in modifying the way that your labor PO looks. But for the most part, if you're comfortable with those settings already, there's not much different between a labor PO and a quote in terms of settings. If you have any questions, or if you have any ideas of how you've been using labor POs in your system, we recommend heading over to our forum. It's at forum.flexrentalsolutions.com. Find this webinar board, or find any of our other boards where you can talk about the different aspects of Flex, and you can share some of your ideas, ask for advice from other users. If you have any questions that are more technical in nature, we ask that you email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.